Greetings, everyone. I am Adria, husband, and I am here with my friend and co-facilitator for this session, Bahati ME from Woods Foundation. I'm going to allow her to introduce herself more fully in just a moment. But to jump right in, I'm going to move us to the next slide and just cover our objectives for this session. We are recording this session as a follow-up to one of our MVP committee sessions that just happened recently. So we're recording this for future reference, hopefully for future MVP committee members and or potentially anyone else who has interest in this topic at DeKalb County Community Foundation or potentially other places. So this session, we hope to cover just understanding a foundational level how the philanthropic and nonprofit sectors came to be. We're also going to hopefully cover and have participants or viewers walk away with an understanding of alternative models of philanthropy and then the role that the MVP committee specifically at DeKalb County Community Foundation plays as a result of kind of all of this context that we'll build throughout our conversation. And then we'll round out our session really thinking about and talking about who we want to be accountable to as we shape this emerging initiative at the foundation. And so I'll pause just for a moment here to do a little bit, and I'll turn it over to Bahati so that you can say a few words and just kind of talk a little bit about maybe how you come to this work and say hello and a little bit about yourself.
Awesome. Thank you. My name is Bahati Aimee, and I serve as a program officer at Woods Fund Chicago, which is a private foundation dedicated to advancing social, economic, and racial justice. And at Woods Fund, we primarily fund organizations that are Black, Indigenous, and led by communities of color in Chicago, working across multiple issues with the goal of structural change. And at the heart of our work is building community power and self-determination. And I come to this work with a clear analysis of the role philanthropy plays within the nonprofit structure. And I know that our nonprofit leaders are essential, but the reality is that many organizations are resource dependent and overly reliant on charitable and government funding. And too many communities are also overly reliant on nonprofits for critical services and resources. And this dynamic creates barriers for communities to thrive. And so in this presentation, we're going to start with really understanding the role of philanthropy that it has within this context of communities and nonprofits. But we'll start with grounding these presentations in the origins of wealth surplus, the historical context of philanthropy as an institution, how this history uniquely impacts Black communities, Indigenous communities, and communities of color and low-income communities. So we can go to the next slide. And we'll start on this slide, grounding ourselves in the origins of wealth in this country. Wealth that has shaped philanthropy policy and the economy we collectively live in today. Much of the wealth that exists here did not come from neutral beginnings. In fact, it came from a surplus that was created through colonization, genocide, slavery, exploitation of labor, and extractive industries. These are the foundations of the US economy and, by extension, the philanthropic sector. Take Indigenous nations, for an example. Their lands were violently dispossessed through government policies like the Indian Removal Act and the Homestead Act. These policies weren't accidents. They were designed to take land from Native people and give it to white settlers, creating wealth for some while devastating Native communities. At the same time, the transatlantic slave trade brought millions of Africans to the Americas. Black people were treated as property, less than human, and forced to work without pay. Their labor built plantation economies, growing crops like cotton, sugar, and tobacco that generated massive wealth for white landowners and the country as a whole. But none of this wealth was given back to the people who actually created it. And the exploitation didn't stop here. After slavery, other groups um, were positioned in hard, often deadly labor. Indigenous people, Mexican laborers, and later Asian and Arab immigrants were pulled into the country's railroads, farms, and plantations. They faced brutal working conditions, low and or no pay, and systemic exclusion from rights and protections. So when we talk about wealth accumulation, we need to name these truths. The surplus that made philanthropy possible was not accidental. It was built through violence, extraction, and exploitation. And these legacies are not just in the past. They show up very uniquely and obviously through racial wealth gaps, in land loss, in inequitable wages, and in who has access to capital today. So, understanding this helps us see why philanthropy and other institutions have the responsibility not just to give back, but to repair the harm and support justice in how wealth is redistributed now. And on the next slide, we'll take a look at a concept called racial capitalism, which helps us connect these dynamics both locally and globally. So now that we've talked about how wealth was built in this country, let's bring in a concept that helps us connect these patterns, racial capitalism. Racial capitalism is the idea that capitalism, our economic system, has always relied on racism to create wealth. In other words, racism isn't separate from the economy. It's built into it. Certain groups of people are intentionally devalued, exploited, or excluded so that others can profit. Wealth is built by extracting labor and resources from communities of color and working class people. We can see this clearly in the history we just reviewed. Land taken from indigenous nations, the unpaid labor of enslaved Africans, and the harsh working conditions forced on immigrants. All of these were ways of turning racism into economic gain. The foundation of racial capitalism is spread across the globe. Essentially, the wealth held by countries in the global north, which on this slide is the blue, was built through colonization, slavery, and resource extraction from the global south, which on the slide is the red. A lot of philanthropy is funded by wealth that was accumulated through these global practices. So when foundations today give out grants, they're not just being generous, they're actually redistributing wealth that was accumulated through destructive practices, creating unequal and brutal conditions in communities here in Illinois and across the global south. For philanthropy, this matters because it challenges us to go beyond charity. It pushes us to ask, how do we confront and undo the ways wealth was built? How do we use resources not just to patch up problems, but to support structural change and repair? And going on to the next slide, we've talked about how wealth was built. We've looked at and worked to understand racial capitalism. And now let's look at how philanthropy became formalized as an institution. Philanthropy, as we know it today, especially big private foundations, really took shape in the early 1900s. Two key policies changes made this possible. In 1913, the IRS created the federal code, tax code allowed for the creation of private foundations. This gave wealthy individuals a way to set aside money permanently in an institution dedicated to giving. And then in 1917, charitable donations became tax deductible. That meant if you were wealthy and gave money to charity, you could lower your tax bill. And so rather than paying higher taxes, often ranging from 20 to 30%, the wealthy could put their money into a foundation. And foundations are only required to spend 5% of their assets each year on grant making. The rest stays invested, growing the foundation's wealth over time. And today, collectively, about $1.5 trillion are sitting in foundation assets. To understand how this works, it's helpful to know a few key terms. So the first is corpus or endowment, and this is the main pot of money that the foundation holds. Think of it as the big savings account that generates income through investments year after year. Investments, most foundations, endowment are invested in the stock market, real estate, or other financial instruments. The idea is that the money will grow over time, but often these investments are in the same exploitative industries that create inequity in the first place. And the last term is grant making. This is the part most people see. When a foundation gives money to a nonprofit or community organizations, um, but also this money is part of that 5% requirement that the IRS has. And oftentimes, foundations remain close to that 5%. It is not the most that a foundation can give out, it is the minimum amount. So when we think about philanthropy, we need to remember it's not just about generosity, it's about policy choices that allowed wealth to be sheltered, protected, and controlled by private institutions instead of being taxed and redistributed through public systems. This helps us see philanthropy not as something neutral, but as a part of the same economic system we've been talking about, capitalism. One where wealth is concentrated in the hands of a few, and decisions about where it goes and how it shapes community is in those same hands. And we can go to the next slide. So taking these kinds of foundations of, philanthropy as an institution, we want to kind of talk about what it looks like, what philanthropy looks like, and how foundations are structured. So let's break down the different kinds of foundations that exist. So not all foundations are the same. They differ in where their money comes from and how they operate. So here are the main types. There's a private foundation. These are usually funded by a single source, an individual, a family, or sometimes a corporation. So they hold large endowments and make grants every year. So that's the kind of foundation I work for. Public foundations are funded by many different donors, individuals, corporations, and sometimes even government grants. Because their funding is more diverse, they often have a stronger connection to the broader public. Corporate foundations, these are created by companies as part of their corporate social responsibility strategies. They use company profits to support charitable activities. And then lastly, community foundations are foundations that pool donations from many people to support a specific geographic region. The idea is to strengthen local communities by keeping resources circulating in that area. So DeKalb Community Foundation is a great example of a community foundation. So understanding these distinctions matters because while they're all technically foundations, their funding sources, decision-making, and accountability can look very different. A community foundation that relies on donors and serves a specific place often has a closer relationship with the community than a large private foundation that is funded by a single wealthy family. And yet, across these types, the same basic structure applies. They exist because of policies that protect and grow wealth, while giving foundations decision-making power over how that wealth is distributed. So the question we want to ask is, how do these structures either bring resources closer to community or keep power concentrated in the hands of very few wealthy people? So we'll go to this next slide and zoom in on the community foundation. And this is the last slide of the historic context. So really bringing it back to the conversation and the presentation that we're having today, we want to zoom in on the DeKalb County Community Foundation as an example. So the DeKalb County Community Foundation, from what I'm learning, describes itself as a philanthropic institution dedicated to enhancing the quality of life in DeKalb County by connecting people who care with causes that matter. That phrase, connecting people who care with causes that matter, captures what community foundations are designed to do. They bring together local donors and local needs. So their money might come from a donor advised fund, which are accounts where individual community members can place their charitable dollars. An endow which creates the endowment, is part of creating the endowment for the community foundation. Um, that is a pot of money that is invested and grows the money that the community foundation can use in their grant making. The annual giving or fundraising, so the Community Foundation likely also is fundraising beyond the funds that are available through the donor advised funds or the DAFs or the endowment. And then lastly, as I've been mentioning, in all of these structures, these foundations are taking the endowment and the money that's available and investing it within the market. And the earnings from those investments are used to support grant making, operations, and new community initiatives. So the mix of funding makes community foundations different from private foundations. They're more rooted in place. They often reflect the values and priorities of a board base of donors. At the same time, um, they still use the same financial tools, endowments, investments, and donor advised funds that can concentrate decision-making power in certain hands. And the opportunity that we all have together, or you all have together, is through the participatory grant making work to expand what that decision making looks like and to have a community of people that directly reflect the DeKalb County supporting and understanding where that funding is can best be used to support community members. And with that, I will transition it back to Adria.
Thank you. So, that was a lot of information, we know. And so hopefully, as you need to, the good thing about a recording is you can go back and rewind, re-listen, as you need to. Um, so we wanted to, structure this conversation to really ground us in some of the historical context as well as um, some local context specific to DeKalb County Community Foundation, but a lot of terminology that will continue to emerge as we continue the conversation. For this next section of our presentation, we want to talk specifically about shifting power. So Bahati really spoke to the accumulation of wealth in the hands of a select few when we think about numerically, and the source of where that wealth accumulation really came from. And again, given the fact that philanthropic organizations are generally service oriented, they need to be charitable institutions. So it's in service. An important call out as well to make here is identifying the fact that philanthropy emerged as a way to also fill some of the holes that are not already covered by a lot of our public services, right? And so, like, our tax dollars flow through the government to provide public service, which is supposed to essentially cover the good of all citizens, whether that is, the roads or public schools or public libraries, things like that, that everyone has access to. There are also, need-based services that the government supports. But where those things fall short is really the hole that nonprofits and philanthropy really fit in to kind of fill some of those gaps. And so we want to talk about how we might shift some dynamics in the structure that exists here. And so, as Bahati mentioned, kind of outside of the very general idea of how grant making works, you have a philanthropic entity, whether it's public, private, a community foundation that has money and then does grant making. And so distributes funds that are for service organizations or nonprofits in a particular way. So community foundations were actually the first model for stepping away from either those public or private entities. And so like a different model. So it was kind of a disruption already in the traditional sense of grant making. And so that was first established in 1914 in this country. And then um, some additional variations to what we would call or refer to as traditional grant making. There have been some more recent shifts, like recent as in the last 5 to 7 years within philanthropic institutions that have really been experimenting with how might we do this differently, because there were definitely tensions that were becoming more and more aware. Um, the sector tends to operate with very much of a scarcity model that nonprofits are often competing with each other for a set pot of money. And so there can be a lot of angst. There can also be a very clear dynamic that the funder holds a lot of the power by the fact that they hold the money that is literally the lifeblood for nonprofits. And so there have been some conversations around how might we shift that dynamic to put more power in the hands of the people who need the money, as well as be intentional about what areas of public good where we, as a foundation, speaking from that lens, would want to contribute to or invest in. And so I'm going to talk through that a little bit. So, some alternatives that have come about, trust-based philanthropy is a term that's been making some movement across the sector. And so, what this means is it speaks to the fact that the way that traditional grant making tends to work or has worked is that nonprofits go through an application process. Usually, the funder sets a window and says, we're going to do one or two or however many grant cycles in a particular calendar year. Nonprofits then respond through a number of requirements that the funder themselves set. So whether that's, a very lengthy application or, not only an application, but often submitting budget and submitting who knows what else. Like there can be lots of different variations. There's no singular method that everyone follows. So each funder has their own preference or process around what that application process looks like. And so that in and of itself creates this sense that there's this need to kind of prove worthiness or ensure that there's this low sense of risk that the funder can take advantage of and feel comfortable, distributing grant dollars. Trust-based philanthropy kind of shifts that dynamic and says, you know what? We're going to kind of remove the hoops that have existed in the past, and we're just going to lean into trust. We're going to say, hey, if we want to fund the arts, for example, and you are an arts entity and you need X amount of dollars, we're going to ask a few questions and we're going to distribute the money. And we're going to trust that you know where you need it, how you want to use that money, and that's how the dynamic will work. So that it's much more of a trust-centered process, and it removes what is kind of associated as suspicion in how this laborious process can kind of work. That second bullet speaks to participatory models. And so this is actually directly speaking to the MVP or Multiple Voices and Perspectives Committee that DeKalb County Community Foundation is establishing. So this can come in the form of a panel. This can be a committee itself. It could also be giving circles. So those are just slight variations, but generally speaking, those members of whatever this entity, whether it's a panel, committee, or giving circle, are given the authority and discretion to build out the grant making priorities and or some level of decision making. And depending upon how or which kind of entity this particular model might be, there could be a variation in how much authority that particular group has. And so we'll speak to that in just a moment. The next possibility is community-based philanthropy. And so this can show up in the form of resources. It is similar to community foundations. These are community specific. So they are a specific demographic area and generally led by folks from the community itself, and usually are comprised of a combination of financial and other types of resources. So it can be other assets in the community, it can be skill-based, targeted resources, concentrated around particular areas that community members say, hey, this is a problem area, or this is an area that we need to expand resource. And so community philanthropy is a very grassroots, would be a good way of describing this kind of an approach. Lastly, we wanted to kind of highlight another alternative in grant making that has, again, in the more recent past 5 to 7 years, has come about, which is Bahati spoke to the fact that traditionally, and this is, really tied to kind of the tax code of philanthropy's requirement to spend 5% of the endowment. We've seen some funders make the decision that they want to go above that 5%, with some funders actually saying they're going to spend down in entirety and made a commitment to do so within X number of years. And so all of those are examples of modifications or alternatives to the traditional kind of what we know to be grant making, that dynamic. So this was where I was kind of alluding to, depending upon how some of these alternatives are set up. This image here that's on the screen is really a spectrum as funders think about how they want to shift power with intention and really explore some of these alternate models. There's really, you can think about it across this particular model here or spectrum. So starting from the left-hand side of the screen, this would kind of be the lower level of shifting of that power. So the intentionality would be we want to consult with what would largely be community driven or folks who are closest to a particular issue area that a funder is interested in investing in. And so a funder may say, well, we'd like to hear from you and receive some feedback or some insight, but ultimately the decision remains with the funder. So that would be that far left column of inform. The next level over of consult would be one level deeper, that there may be some exchange, maybe deeper listening in terms of like hearing what community needs are, or hearing some maybe public feedback sessions. But again, that decision-making power and authority still remains with the funder in that particular instance. In that middle column of involve, it's kind of again, one layer deeper, but a mix between fully shifting over some of that decision-making power and keeping it within the realm of the funder themselves. And so this is a much more intentional decision to incorporate feedback from community and or whoever is being consulted in this process. And then the decision is kind of made with strong weight behind that feedback that is received. The next layer over would be collaboration. So this is where there's a little more freedom and flexibility around that consultation, where a funder would look to engage individuals from the community, for example, around like, what if we went beyond what traditional funding or grant making looks like? What are some innovations we might want to make? And then those decisions, those recommendations, the suggestions coming from the community themselves would be very much embedded into that decision-making process and then implemented. And then all the way to the right-hand side of this spectrum, the empower is literally, we will implement what you decide. And so an important note here to just shout out DeKalb County Community Foundation. The leadership has confirmed, Dan Templeton has definitely said that we want to land on that far right-hand column. So the MVP committee will be really empowered to really shape the grant making process, the criteria, what that looks like, reviewing applications all the way through to recommendations. Of course, all grant recommendations do go through the board, which will continue to be the case. But that's really a wonderful initiative. It's a wonderful decision on behalf of everyone at the DeKalb County Community Foundation, and it's really exciting to be a part of this newly emerging initiative at this time. So I'm going to continue on and dig a little bit into one particular um, release from Edgar Villanueva that came out in 2019. So this is his book that is entitled Decolonizing Wealth, and it made a lot of waves in the philanthropic sector. And so Edgar was a former program officer and worked at, I think, more than one foundation, and really documented this in this book. He's also an indigenous member of the Lumbee tribe, and so really reflected upon his whole experience in philanthropy through the lens of his own identity and really named a lot of power dynamics and practices and policies that um, he felt repeating a lot of the violence that Bahati's kind of spoke to at the beginning of this presentation, and really upholding a lot of these status quo practices where a few individuals who were holding the power and decision making around funding, given the historical roots of that source of funding, and it just was not sitting well with Edgar, and so he made a bold move and really came forward with his book release, and this was also pre-pandemic, and there was also kind of making a lot of waves. And then around the time of the pandemic and the murder of George Floyd, and a lot of awareness happening, and really a moment in time that we're all well aware of at this point, where there was a convergence of a lot of factors that really brought race and all of capitalism and a lot of oppressive systems to the forefront for us to finally have some conversations around it. And so, as a result of this, a lot of funders in the sector started to really be intentional around asking questions around their source of funding, around how their grant making is looking, and what their processes look like, where they are on that spectrum. And so it really brought forward a lot of valuable and innovative conversations, and you'll see a lot of iterations of grant making happening as a result today. And so, just to kind of highlight the impact of Villanueva's book, he offered a very sharp critique. And I mean, sharp critique is one way to put it. Others might say he was truth telling, depending upon your lens and how you look at it. But he really named pretty explicitly the ways in which the philanthropic sector upholds legacies of white supremacy culture. And there's a lot of language, there's a lot more content that we can potentially link in here as well to dig deeper on that terminology around white supremacy culture. And or please read the book because it's really good. Also, it was a call to action for the sector around those roots of accumulated wealth and the push or the call to ask all philanthropic organizations to do that internal investigation. Every philanthropic organization has its own story. And so it's important to ask those questions and do that work. And so that was another really important kind of call to the field around that, and to really trace the lines back and see what that source of wealth really came from, and the ties to what Bahati spoke to at the beginning of the conversation around the exploitation and extraction of labor and land from indigenous Black and Brown communities in this country. And so the last point here was really another call to move beyond diversity and inclusion efforts and really leaning into an indigenous based practice of this, what he refers to as the seven steps of healing, which he kind of gets into much more detail in the latter part of the book. On this next slide, this is kind of a highlight and a snapshot of those seven steps. And so there's really quite a bit to cover in each of the steps, but I will run through each of them at as high of a level as we have reflected here. But again, highly encourage you to dig into this as well and read this wonderful work by Edgar. So the first step is really around acknowledgement and grief. So stopping to feel the hurts that have been done in the past and what the impact of that hurt is. So really, that in and of itself is a whole process to stop and grieve before we want to jump to action, before we want to do anything else. First, just stop and feel, because a lot of conversations around racial capitalism, around racism, around oppression tend to be very cognitive, and true transformation actually needs to happen beyond our head. It needs to move into our heart and our body as well. So that's a really important first step in the process that he highlights. The second is to apologize for the hurts that have been caused as a result of this manifestation of this entire kind of sector. And again, really rooted in the roots of this conversation, the historical roots of this accumulation of wealth. The third step is around listening. So, really leaning into the wisdom of the folks who have been marginalized, who have been excluded, and particularly exploited by this system, because the belief is that the people who have been most impacted by the violence of these systems have the answers to solve for them. And so that's a really important kind of positionality in this particular framework that he's offering. The fourth is around relating. And so really showing up authentically, kind of removing the hats that we wear often in these dynamics between a funder and a nonprofit. There's a positionality there. And in that positionality, one of those entities holds the power, and one of those entities is trying to get the resources that that person of power has. And so this is kind of removing some of those barriers to really hear each other and be able to create an environment where you can have some authentic conversations and exchanges to have greater impact at the end of the day. The fifth step is around representation. So this is around really the essence of this conversation around alternatives to traditional grant making, and how do we build different tables? How do we build circles? How do we build committees and panels that really center the folks who have been most impacted and allow them to make the decisions around where these resources go and are needed. And then the sixth one, investment. So this is again going back to one of the points Bahati mentioned around the investments that funders are making. Oftentimes can be in sectors, in companies that are perpetuating harm. And so that's a whole other layer within this context of thinking about philanthropy that again, Edgar was kind of putting out a call to the sector to really take some time and be intentional around. The seventh step is around repair and really this idea of using money to heal and to stop the hurt. And so to interrupt these systems, the status quo systems that are perpetuating a lot of stress, strain, and repression, and instead moving into a space where money can really be used to heal some of these long-standing problems that are sustained through the structures that we are all existing within. So in our real conversation, we paused to have a little bit of conversation here together. Um, but since this is a recording, we'll continue. The last part of our conversation was really around accountability and really thinking about um, how we want to think about this concept of accountability. And Bahati, maybe I'll toss it over to you to kick us off with that first kind of prompt.
Yeah, thank you. Um, Adria, that was really great. Um, yeah, we've covered so much ground in this presentation. And as we've mentioned before, this is a repeat presentation that we did with the MVP. And some of the questions that we were really exploring with them was about accountability. So, as a participatory grant making space, knowing that they don't quite have thinking about that spectrum that Adria had shared of where the foundation might be now and where the foundation is heading, the MVP, the group of folks they're not quite at that level of really having decision-making power over the foundation as a whole. But thinking about what it is that they have the opportunity to make decisions on in this moment, what does accountability look like for the foundation and for their leadership within the DeKalb County community? But really, because we're not sharing this presentation with them, we're shifting those questions to think about as leaders in this foundation. We're just asking you to take some time. Maybe you can pause this presentation and reflect about what you're sitting with, um, what you're reflecting on, um, even within the three sections, right? Thinking about the historical context. What are you sitting with? What might be new to you? What did you maybe not have the language for? How are you thinking about the history of philanthropy as an institution and wealth surplus differently? Thinking about shifting power. What are some of the reflections that are coming up? Not only about this opportunity for the MVP to be doing this work as, the beginnings of understanding what shifting power looks like, but what could it really look like to build more of a relationship with the MVP in terms of building the power of the group and the power of that grant making mechanism for the community foundation, while also being accountable and really letting the group be able to make the decisions that they know are best given, their experience, not only as leaders, but as individuals within the DeKalb community. And then lastly, really sitting with some of the ideas that were explored around decolonizing wealth and Edgar Villanueva. What is it bringing up for you as a important leader in this work at the foundation as you think about accountability? What may be uncomfortable for you? What may you be more curious about, or even want to, interrogate as leaders? And what resources and support do you need in exploring those conversations? Because they're not easy conversations, they're complex, but they're very, very necessary. Um, and then another question that we had for the group was thinking about your role as a leader at this foundation. Um, what does it look like to actually, advocate for some of the work that is to come, right? Once you take this work on, in terms of really thinking about how to shift the relationship of the foundation in building the power of communities in the DeKalb County to be able to make decisions about where investments may go, both grant making and also endowment investments, right? Um, what's your role in that? And then the last question that we have is really around holding yourself accountable. As I had mentioned before, this is important work. It can be complex in terms of really kind of shifting paradigms, shifting the ways that you think about things, and challenging the status quo. However, what do you need in order to hold yourself accountable? And then what does it look like to hold each other accountable in this space as well?
Thank you for that. And um, all of those questions, we definitely encourage you to take some time, think about them. Um, and, we did speak from a lot of these are broad concepts. Again, the intent around this conversation was really like philanthropy 101 to kind of do some broad strokes. And there are always nuances. So the particular instances of how that dynamic looks, what the real parameters, what the true story is for DeKalb County Community Foundation will be unique to your organization. And so we encourage you to say, well, let's explore and let's see. And really, that's a part of this idea of sitting with reflection. I really think about accountability as a point of inflection or reflection to say, like, here's where we want to be. This is truly where our intentions are. And let's really piece apart and look at from the smallest things to how do we engage? Because you're already a community foundation, and so inherently you are deeply embedded in the community. You have tremendous relationships across all sorts of entities from public sector to governmental to nonprofits to community-based members. So you're already there. What does that look like to deepen it? What does it look like to do things differently? Has Are there ways that that power dynamic can be shifted even more? What might innovation look like to get further down the road on that spectrum at every level of the organization? So there's always some things to do. There's always more to kind of think about and reflect on. So we really do hope that this has been a valuable conversation and will continue to be a resource that the foundation can use into the future. And with that, I'm going to stop the recording and we're going to say bye.